Hello everyone, I'm Cypher Mercury, and in this video, I'll be making a game in 10 minutes, 30 minutes, and an hour. I was contemplating making the game in HTML with JavaScript, or using a game engine like Unity, Godot, however you pronounce it. Thinking it'd be faster, I went with Unity. To keep this simple, I just stayed in the same project, and started by giving myself 10 minutes, then 20, then 30. Now that I think about it, I'm basically just making a game in an hour. Starting my project, I made a simple circle, which will act as the player, and I made a spike. Not sure what to make, I just went with what seemed obvious. You, the player, are falling endlessly, and there are spikes below you that you must dodge. I gave the player and spike collision components, so I can detect when and what to do when they collide. Here, the code checks if the spike collides with the player. If it does, then the player object will be deleted. Somehow, I kept forgetting to assign the collisions to the objects, so I ended up wasting a bunch of precious time. Unfortunately, the game in the first 10 minutes wasn't in a playable state, so I had to move on to my next 20 minutes. During my 20 minutes, I had a few goals. My goals were to make spikes spawn below the player, balance the move speed with the spike spawning rate, make a lose or retry function, and implement a scoring system. It took me around 6 minutes to get spikes spawning in, and when they finally did start spawning in, they were spawning in the wrong direction. This would be a game changer. A problem like this, no way can be solved. Oh wait, all I had to do was change a positive to a negative. The spikes were spawning in the right direction and everything was working well. Now all I had left to do was make a scoring system and a retry option. So I made a game manager script. This will hold the score and do some other things, and a spike script, which will tell the game manager to increase its score whenever the spike passes the player. Here I am setting up the UI and assigning objects to the correct variables in the code, so I can access the objects and change various things about them. I also made the background color black so the player and spikes stand out more. I made a slight error in my code and got a couple errors. Luckily, fixing it was as easy as assigning an object to a variable. With only 1 minute left, I couldn't figure out why the score wasn't increasing. Luckily, I was able to figure out in time. The spike didn't have the script I made for it. In the last couple seconds, I was able to assign the script to the spike. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make the respawn function in time, but I got all my other goals complete. And here's how the game plays after being worked on for a total of 30 minutes. If you noticed, the game becomes a lot more difficult depending on the resolution. I figured this was because the player was moving down at the speed of FPS. When the game window was larger, it had better FPS, but when it was smaller, it was lower. But more FPS means more frames per second, so the game was being played faster than normal. Starting my 30 minutes, the first thing I wanted to work on was making a working game loop, so you wouldn't have to close and restart the game every time you wanted to retry. Here, I'm coding the restart function in the game manager, so every time the function is called, it sets the score back to 0 and resets the player's position. I also have it delete all the spikes from the previous round, so they don't get in the way of the next attempt. An annoying issue came up where the code was auto-implementing references I didn't want, which were also causing errors, so I removed the code that was getting in the way. And with all that, I have a working retry button. Looking back, I realize how bad it looks, but it works. I made the spike slightly larger because the game felt too easy in its current state, and I just didn't like how close in size the player was to the spike. Next, I noticed the player could still move after they died. Although they couldn't really do anything, that wasn't intended. So going back to the code, I made it so the left and right move speed relies on the same speed that the player falls, which is paused by the game manager when the player dies. I also quickly made it so the more score you get, the more spikes spawn, so the game gets progressively more difficult. On one of the test runs, I didn't move for a while, and I noticed it's pretty rare for a spike to be directly below the player, so I added some code that spawns a spike directly below the player, so you always have to be moving. While coding this, I also tried making it so the spikes wouldn't be deleted until they are out of screen. Unfortunately, they just kept adding score, so I had to add another variable to the spike scripts, which would check if they already added score, and if they did, they can no longer add score. Finally, I wanted to add a high score system, so I rushed to implement that within my last 5 minutes. I got the high score system working way sooner than expected, and with my last 2 minutes, I went back through the code and optimized and cleaned up, so the code would be easier to read. And with all that, I finished making a game in 1 hour. This is totally what it looks like. Making a game in 1 hour was a very fun challenge, the first of many game making challenges I'll try. If you want to try the game, there's a link in the description to an itch page where you can download the game. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment, it'd really help. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.